I'm going to go ahead and get started, just to be respectful of everyone's time. Welcome to our monthly bridge, our monthly, bridge build, not bridge builders, but sorry, excuse me. Welcome to our lunch break, where we talk about monthly, every different topics. Today we are talking about how have COVID and COVID policies have affected Michigan's K-12 students. I am so excited to share this opportunity and experience with you. Just for everyone's information, this will be recorded and this will be posted soon afterwards. We will let everyone know when the recording is up. I am introducing you. I'm Josiah Foster. I am the Development Associate here at Bridge, Michigan. Here on my team, I have Amber DeLynn. She is our Membership Director and our Engagement Specialist. And we have Katharine Strunk, and she is our Development Specialist. Our reporters on the call, we have Ron French. He is our Enterprise reporter. So glad to have him here. And I have a special introduction for all of you, especially if you like education reporting. We have our new education reporter. I'm so proud to present her, Isabel Lohman. She is here. If you want, feel free to direct message her, say hi to her. She's new here and she's going to help moderate questions at the end of this talk. I want to move this forward and I want to introduce our three speakers. I have Dr. Strunk here. Katharine Strunk, or Dr. Strunk, is the faculty director of EPIC and is the Clifford E. Erickson Distinguished Chair in the Education and Professor of Education Policy in the Professor in Education Policy by the Courtesy Economics at the Michigan State University. She has worked extensively with district and state policymakers, including working with the Los Angeles United School District and the California and Michigan Departments of Education to help decision makers formulate, design, and revise policy. Dr. Strunk has received her PhD in Educational Administration and Policy and her MA in Economics from Stanford University and her BA in Public Policy from Princeton University. Next on our panel, we have Jeremy Singer. He is a doctoral candidate at the Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at Wayne State University and is a research assistant for the Detroit Educational Research Partnership. He formerly taught at Detroit Public Schools. Jeremy now has an MA at the University of Michigan, Go Blue. He is currently a doctoral student, as I said before, at Wayne State University. Next, we have Tanya Pitkin is a school-age child in a public school and volunteers at the Parent-Teacher Association, or for those who don't know, is the PTA Association. She is a past unit president at her child's elementary school and a current president at her PTA council. Tanya works with leaders and parents in her school district, but all across the state. She has also been appointed to the Michigan PTA Board of Directors in August 2019 and is currently serving a second two-year term. For over 125 years, the PTA has been the largest child's group in the nation, and their mission is to make every child potential a reality by engaging and empowering families and communities and to advocate for all children. So I'm going to hand it over to Ron French to moderate this wonderful panel, and I can't wait to get started.
Well, I can't either, Josiah. This is going to be great. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Once again, I'm Ron French. I am Enterprise Reporter and Associate Editor here at Bridge. The reason you're stuck with me for part of this session is because I used to cover education for a long time for Bridge. I'm sort of deep in the weeds in some of the COVID things that we're going to be talking about today. Over the past 2 years, it's been a struggle. It's been a slog. Let's admit it, for everyone, and no one more than educators and students and the parents of those students. It's been tough. I'm up here in northern Michigan at the moment, and just trying to get back and forth in my car. It's like I'm I'm walking through a foot deep snow, and I'm thinking this is sort of like, for the past year, schools have been like running a marathon through deep snow. It's so exhausting, and it seems like you're never going to get to the finish line. And hopefully, we're getting close now. Over the past 2 years, all our students have gone back and forth from learning at home, trying to figure out all that out, to learning at school, and oftentimes switching back to learning at home. There have been people who have lost, students who have lost graduation and proms. There have been students who have lost athletic seasons because of COVID, either because the seasons were canceled or because someone tested positive and they all were out. School protocols have gone back and forth a lot of times from mandatory masks in a lot of school systems. Distance between desks from at 6 feet to 3 feet to who knows what it is at the moment. Testing protocols, it's tough to keep track, and everyone's sick, but I understand that. But beyond the frustration, we want to try to talk today about what that impact has been on our schools and our students. And luckily on this panel, we got 3 great people to talk to. Why don't we start with Dr. Strunk? Dr. Strunk, I know you've done some, you and your group have done a lot of this fantastic research on data-related research on how things have gone. What sort of impact has COVID and the COVID protocols had on students?
That's a great question. So overall, research around the country, not just in Michigan, has shown that students were very impacted by the pandemic, both in terms of learning growth, but also in terms of mental and socio-emotional health, physical health of kids. And these impacts were felt much more deeply in lower income urban areas with more students of color. So at EPIC, we've examined the impacts in particular on the state's lowest performing schools and districts, which are called the partnership districts here. These communities were just harder hit by the pandemic overall. So they had higher case rates, higher hospitalization rates, and higher death rates overall cumulatively, but also at the very beginning of the pandemic. And teachers in partnership districts estimated that over a quarter to almost half of their students had an immediate family member who had contracted COVID in that first few months to year of the pandemic. And that about over half of their students had experienced substantial socio-emotional trauma as a result of the pandemic. Many students, according to their teachers, faced food insecurity, homelessness, housing instability, a lack of access to healthcare, a lack of access to mental health care services. And teachers told us that the most salient challenges for their students in their districts were both having new childcare responsibilities. So over 70% of teachers said that was a major challenge for their students, and also having parents or guardians who are frontline workers. So the far majority of teachers told us that was a major challenge. Those are particularly alarming statistics when you think about the fact that these districts were the most likely to be remote at the beginning of the school year and also throughout the school year in 2021. And when they did shift to more in-person instruction, it was mostly to a hybrid form of instruction as opposed to fully in person. So the students that were losing access to health services and things like that as a result of the pandemic that was sustained throughout the entire year.
I think a lot of people on this Zoom are probably fairly familiar with what's happening in their own school and maybe what's happening in Michigan. Do you have a sense from either from the data or from talking to colleagues around the country, is what the sort of things that you're seeing, the impact you're seeing in Michigan, is that pretty typical for what's has happened around the country?
Absolutely. It was happening across the country. Every single state, every single report we've seen that's come out has shown these exact same things happening, in Michigan, and especially in these kinds of districts in Michigan as in the other parts of the country.
Okay, thank you. Tanya, as director of the Michigan PTA, you represent students and parents, from the whole spectrum across the state. What type of things are you hearing in your capacity, in your position, and also just as I'm sure you talk to people, in your position, colleagues and friends, and about how you're hearing from parents about how this has impacted their kids?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ron, for having me today. What we're seeing is kind of what Dr. Strunk talked about. Students and families are experiencing a wide variety of, each experience has been so different. The families that struggled to choose between virtual learning and in-person learning last year, to the families that had no choice, that only were allowed to do virtual learning. Families that, had to struggle working from home, and all the different students on different devices and internet issues, to the students that, didn't have a Wi-Fi access and would have to get in a car and travel somewhere to even attend school online. Families, in my neighborhood, we had a lot of conversations just about how family life was different. Some families, traveled a lot for work, and we're now home all the time. So learning different routines, our kids are impacted by that as well.
Right. And just as I'm sure all of us know, that it seems like if you would read stories back from March of 2020 and you read stories today, it's just been such a changes over time, what we know about COVID, what we can and cannot do. And that's happened obviously in the schools. I suspect that there's been, it must be difficult for parents to understand what they should be doing to protect their families and what is maybe something that isn't necessary. Is there a lot of differences you see between what parents think should happen here?
Yeah, absolutely. Every parent, their number one goal is to protect their student, protect their child, and get them the best education available to them. Parents are used to being able to volunteer in the classroom and see day to day what those what students are experiencing. And that's a huge miss that, that we've missed the last 2 years, with visitors not being in the buildings and that family support system being mostly online, and, teacher conferences online. Our students kind of struggled a little bit with that. And, we're on Facebook, we're reading newspaper articles, and everybody's, trying to share what they think, is best for their family. But like you said, it's always changing, and we're reacting as well.
Sure, absolutely. Jeremy, you've done research around specifically Detroit families' experiences with COVID-19 and school attendance. I think you released a report on this in late 2021. Can you tell our viewers here what some of those key findings were?
Yeah, absolutely. Just a quick note: we surveyed Detroit public schools students. I'm assuming though that the dynamics are relatively similar among the many families who attend charter schools in the city as well. So the first and most important thing is absenteeism in the city. It increased substantially during the pandemic last school year. We define this as missing 10% or more days. So, 18 days in a 180-day school year, which is a lot. And we focus on this because if students are missing school, that's an indicator that they may be facing challenges in their lives. And of course, absenteeism has consequences for their development and their later outcomes. And in general, Detroit already has one of the highest levels of absenteeism of any major US city. And that for the Detroit Public Schools District, the numbers spiked from 60% before the pandemic to over 70% or around 70% during the pandemic. And the number of students who were severely chronically absent, so, missing 20, 30, 40% of days, that also jumped as well. So more than half of students in the district fell into that severe category. We found that computer and internet issues were a huge problem. The district was able to distribute computers to students, but there were technology issues in terms of the quality of the computers and the internet. And, it was a massive undertaking to service those devices. The district did a lot of work setting up tech hubs and so on. And then to some of the things that Tanya was speaking about too, we heard a lot in interviews that we did follow up about the challenges that families had for actually supervising remote learning, whether that was a new burden that was on them, or whether they weren't able to actually do that consistently because of their obligations to go to work. And then, of course, as Katharine mentioned, students who were more socioeconomically disadvantaged, they bore the brunt of this. But, I would say in Detroit, where the population is already, there's a very large low-income population, we saw that there are still even differences among those families. So our severely absentee students were in families with even greater socioeconomic disadvantage. And And just the last highlight is broadly across the board. Families reported negative impacts for their health, for their financial well-being, for the logistics that they faced on a day-to-day basis, the kinds of things that Katharine was speaking to earlier as well.
Jeremy, I know that this survey specifically looked at Detroit, but do you have a sense whether absenteeism went up around the state, or this was something that's typical around the country, or is this something Detroit specific?
So we at Wayne State haven't specifically done a statewide analysis, but I would certainly expect that attendance patterns, that attendance got worse on average in general. And I would say, these are some of the similar problems that Tanya spoke to earlier. Lots of families face new burdens and challenges with supervising remote learning. There were health and economic effects on lots of families. And in particular, while not every context is as high poverty as a place like Detroit, families who are facing challenging economic circumstances are likely to have faced some of the similar challenges, whether it's access to quality technology or challenges in the sort of home dynamics during the pandemic, or loss of income and other stresses that go along with that. I would just say really quick that, Katharine spoke about this earlier. Districts differed in terms of when they opened their schools back up for in-person learning and to what degree. And so those sort of school decisions and other contextual factors definitely mattered, along with these health and economic impacts. And I would just say too that, of course, Detroit is not our only high poverty and racially isolated city in the state. So I would especially expect to see similar things in other places that share the sort of demographic and spatial composition that Detroit has. Although, cases were particularly high in Detroit, especially early on in the pandemic. So it's hard to say exactly whether the pandemic hit those places quite as hard or, in quite the same way. And we definitely need a sort of statewide look at that.
Yeah, I agree. That's fascinating. We talked a lot about the impacts on kids and their families, but I'm just wondering about what impact that has had academically. Dr. Strunk, is there data out there that would give any indication yet about what learning has been like? Has it kept up? Has it slowed down? Has it stopped completely? What's the past year or so look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. So EPIC has examined both the benchmark assessment data that's come out in the last year. So the state legislature did require that districts administer one of 4 approved benchmark assessments in the 21-22 school year, 22-23, and then also this past year. And we also look at the M-STEP scores from 2021 spring compared to earlier years. I will say, just as a caveat, participation rates were very low and they were different across different districts. And so we actually know that about 71% of kids took the M-STEP last year, and those kids are more likely to be white and higher income. So we're probably actually underestimating any kind of growth in learning over the last year when we look at these numbers. But we do show that students did learn over the course of the 2021 school year, just at a much slower rate than we would expect in a typical school year. This was particularly the case for certain groups of students. So the same students that we've been talking about, low-income students, Black and Latino students, and students with disabilities. So this means that the achievement gaps that were already in existence prior to the pandemic were made substantially larger during the pandemic. Students who learned remotely were also more adversely impacted. And so we were able to look at, at the collected data that was shared with the state every month, and we produced it on the state website as well as our own, to show what learning modality districts were offering each month. And we show that districts that were remote for longer had more students performing substantially below proficiency or below grade level. So for every 1 month additional remote education that students were offered by a district during the 2021 school year, about 1 percentage point more students scored significantly behind grade level. So if this district was remote for the entire year, about 9 percentage point more students were scoring significantly behind grade level. So this again has really big equity impacts that we need to be thinking about in Michigan as we go forward. And again, Ron, to preview your question, this is the same thing we're seeing across the country. So these are the exact same patterns that we're seeing in other states. You're
stealing my questions, Katharine. But no, and this next is either for you, Katharine, or Jeremy, or maybe both of you. Because if I were a parent of a young child having gone through this, my question would be, yes, I realize this has happened. Do they catch up? Or by the time they are graduate, are they still going to be a year behind where they would have been, or whatever? Are either of you, as researchers, familiar with research that has been done in other traumatic events where it affected learning. The thing that comes to my mind, and you probably have other examples, would be Katrina in New Orleans, where perhaps I'm sure there's research on like learning impact on some events, and some event that's been long enough ago that you can see whether kids caught up to where they would have normally been, or once they're that far behind, are they there?
I would caution against trying to make a comparison against things like other events, because I mean, other events come with other issues. And Katrina in particular, I know has been talked about a lot. If you look at Doug Harris's work out of Tulane, who's done a huge amount of work on the effects of Katrina, but also New Orleans restructured its entire school district as a result. And so it's really hard to know what caused what. Let me just talk for a second about what we could do to catch kids up. Doing nothing or business as usual is just not going to do it. So I get asked all the time by district leaders, how long will it take for our students to catch up? I was like, well, what are you doing to help them catch up? So that's the question. And that's a $1 million question. If we knew how to make kids learn faster, we would have done it years ago, right? And so one thing that we do know from the literature is that more time in seats matters. So the more time we spend on instruction, the more students will learn. And there's probably a diminishing return at some point, but we definitely don't hit it at the point we're at now. So that means, maybe extended school hours, maybe an extended school year, summer schools for kids who are really struggling. The second thing we know has been really effective is small group instruction with differentiation, ideally by, a tutor of some sort who this student can create a personal relationship with. This tutor can really get to know them. And there have been sort of larger and smaller scale studies across the country prior to and during the pandemic that have shown that this is actually a very effective way to help meet kids where they are and help them learn what they need to learn to be back on grade level. Jeremy, do you have anything else that maybe from your research?
I'm mostly going to defer to you here. The only thing I'll add is that, one of our big focuses is on how out of school conditions shape, what actually happens in schools. And so, of course, not only as Katharine was talking about earlier, have students taken a hit in their learning in general and have sort of disparities between traditionally disadvantaged students and not widened. But once we implement these plans, the inequalities that structured those original disparities are going to keep creating challenges for our efforts to catch people up, right? So if we, for example, contribute equal resources to these communities, then the challenges that we have in those communities are going to lead to those resources having differential impacts, right? We have to have a really careful attention to the equity of what investments we make and the adequacy of them given the conditions that students in schools are facing.
Thank you. Thank you. Tanya, I know the Michigan PTA met with Senator Stabenow at one point last year to discuss equity around Michigan's return to school plans. What is your impression of how that worked? How do you still have concerns about that issue?
Yeah, absolutely. We met with Senator Stabenow's office, and we actually met with all members of federal members of Congress in Michigan last year and talked about the same things. We talked about infrastructure has to include broadband and access to high-speed internet. So when they're looking at budget proposals and funding for that, that's a huge impact on schools. School buildings are old. When we're given money, the schools that are the oldest have to take care of things like windows that don't open before they hire counselors to help students. So making sure that all of that is included. And we also talked a lot about nutritional waivers through the USDA. This was a huge impact on parents. Students that don't have to worry about if lunch is going to be there for them can learn better in the classroom. So all of these things we talked with our members of Congress. And then to circle back to your actual question there, we're very supportive of parents being at the table when those return to learn plans were implemented and developed in your school district. More voices at the table meant more students' experiences could be addressed. So our special education students required a much different amount of resources and capabilities when it came to online learning. Parents were the best indicators of what they could do in the home to help with those and partner with their teachers. So making sure that parents were at the table was key when we discussed a lot of return to learn plans.
Thank you. Jeremy, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on or research either way on how COVID, these past 2 years and COVID policies perhaps have affected college readiness. How many children, how many students qualify for merit scholarships, and admissions in the upcoming years. I know that college admissions aren't going the right direction at the moment, but just can you talk about that at all? I mean, what especially in marginalized communities, what do you think the impact's going to be?
I'll say what little I can on the topic, and
Sure.
maybe Catherine has more to add, or Tanya, but so what I can say is that in Detroit, attendance in 12th grade was way worse than in every other grade. We're pretty sure that this has had a negative consequence for high school graduation and diploma attainment. And we have ongoing work that's looking at both graduation in the city and college enrollment. I myself, I'm not really a higher education person, but I've certainly seen colleagues in our field talking a lot about the decline in enrollment at community colleges and other four-year institutions. And so I would, see if I can dig up some recommendations, but I think there's a lot of work that folks are doing in showing that this has jeopardized the sort of trajectory of graduation rates and degree attainment, both for K-12 and higher ed. I think the impact has been toughest in places like Detroit. Other than that, I'll have to defer.
Oh, no problem at all. Catherine, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I'm the same. We haven't studied that at Epic.
Okay.
I do think from around the country, we've seen a pretty negative impact on college enrollment rates, on FAFSA completion rates last year. So I think we're going to see this hit. And again, certain kinds of districts were more affected by the pandemic. And so these are the districts that already probably struggled with matriculating kids into college. And so I think we're going to see this inequitably as well across the country.
This is a question for any of you. So just jump in if you have some thought on it. We know there's a growing concern and rightly so on an uptick in mental health related emergency department visits. And I know concerns in the public schools among children under 18. Is there any work that has been done that looks at, whether COVID policies have exacerbated that in any way? I know that some people say, oh, people wearing masks somehow has done this. It's more isolation and being at home, so you're not around counselors and teachers. Has there been any research that would try to quantify that yet?
So I think there's been research that shows that the pandemic has increased the mental health problems in all sets of the society, in particular for kids in middle and high school in particular. I don't know that we can say that any of the mitigation strategies that people have put into place, other than maybe remote instruction, which, like you said, keeps kids from counselors, but there's not a lot of evidence that masking has caused any mental harm to students at all. And there's been some conversation around it, but that's different from empirical evidence. But there has been a lot of good research that shows correlationally that during the pandemic, mental health referrals went up, mental health emergencies went up. And unfortunately, we weren't able to reach some of the kids who were the most in need during that time because, counselors and teachers are the first responders in some ways. They're the ones who notice first when a student is not doing well. And we think that we've missed a lot in the last 2 years as well.
Yeah, Tanya, are you hearing anything on the topic of mental health or stress from your parents?
Definitely, it's on everyone's mind. Parents are going through the same mental health struggles. So trying to help their children through it is a challenge in and of itself. I think Catherine brought up a great point. Counselors and trusted adults were something a lot of our students lacked when they were going through the most. So reaching out now, whether your school is doing some surveys so parents can dictate, hey, my kid needs a little bit more help. We're worried about this, and working with the staff there to get them what they need to open up, talk to friends. Counselors are the first line of defense, but our kids see their friends every day. And talking with your kids even about, hey, if you've got a friend that's struggling, how can we help them? Who should we talk to? Who needs to become involved, and at what point in this conversation?
Tanya, let me apologize right now. I'm going to go off script for a second here, but I'm going to stick with you for a second and ask a question, and feel free to deflect if you don't feel comfortable answering it. But the something that I, as a journalist, hear a lot of times, and I know I talk to a lot of educators, it just seems like there's a lot of anger out there right now around schools on a lot of subjects. Do you get a sense that maybe that's reducing some now that the COVID protocols are decreasing, or do you think that sort of anger is broader than that about whatever? Do you have any sense of that?
So I can speak to it a little. So I think parents have felt we've made a lot of choices for our children. We choose how to raise them. The pandemic, in theory, took away a lot of those choices. I think that's where the anger comes in, is we want to do better. We see how it used to be. We see how it could be. But we're also impacted by those COVID policies, by the terms of our employers, everything in general. So to say there's more anger, I think in certain circumstances there definitely are examples of that, and we've witnessed that. But I think it's more frustration. It's more about wanting to do something, wanting to get back to normal, wanting to go into a new direction. And, frankly, everyone's sick of the pandemic. Everyone, but just being sick of it doesn't mean it's over either. So
thank you. Frustration is probably a better word. Thank you for offering that. And Jeremy, I wanted to go back to your research a little bit, where you found that like 50% of all families in DPS experienced a lot of issues, financial, mental health, logistical challenges during the pandemic. Do those, I don't know how to phrase this other than in very simple terms, but does that sort of go away with COVID, or do you think this is something that this is a long-standing problem that is going to be increased here in Detroit?
There are going to be lingering impacts of this, even if case rates continue to go down. If we're able to sort of emerge or get into an endemic stage with the pandemic. Stress and strain, this has been a theme in what Tanya has been saying and what I've seen in our research as well. That stress is going to have a lasting impact as people kind of cope with all the challenges that they've had. And I think the financial impact is something we shouldn't lose sight of. I've certainly heard from parents, we saw in our survey data as well, that people lost jobs. Either they were fired because of business decisions during the pandemic and loss of revenue, or they left their jobs in order to staff the home during remote learning. And in a lot of cases, I'm seeing that people haven't returned yet. I think that there's a survey out of the University of Michigan, Detroit Metro Area Community Survey. They found, I think it was a third or a fourth of Detroit parents, so specifically parents as opposed to just Detroit adults, are interested in returning to the labor force. 1 out of 4 of them still haven't yet, or maybe it was 1 out of 3. But from my interviews, I'm hearing some reasons for that. Some are having trouble finding work, especially after a sudden gap in their resume. Some are still feeling that there's uncertainty and unpredictability when it comes to the virus, and they don't want to enter a new job just to have to come back home to supervise remote learning, a month later. And of course, there were so many great initiatives from the state government, from the federal government to help ease the economic burden on families. Tanya mentioned the flexibility around food during the pandemic, which is great. But the crunch on families' budgets is going to have an impact now. I'm sorry, that's my dog. An impact now and potentially like a lasting impact as well. I would just say, our data so far is mostly on self-reported. What's the hardship been? What has the impact been? So I think additional studies that focus on the long-term impacts and that use more precise information on how much income did families actually lose? What was their duration of unemployment and so on? These will be really important things to pay attention to moving forward, not just for the families and then of course for the children and their long-term life outcomes, and then for the health of our cities and our state as a whole.
Thank you. We want to make sure we leave plenty of time for a lot of great reader questions, but I want to ask each of you the same question, sort of as a wrap up here. You know, we know there's a lot we're going to want to try to forget about these last 2 years, you know, and get past. But I'm wondering, as far as education goes, are there lessons that we've learned during this period of time that will benefit education? Is there something positive that schools and parents and students, for that matter, can build on from these past 2 years? Katharine, why don't I start with you?
That's a great question. I'm sure we all have similar and different answers, so I'll give a couple, but then I'm going to leave time for the other folks too. One thing I think we've learned is resilience. So, you know, I hear parents say to me all the time, and I have 2 4th graders in public schools, so I can tell you we've learned a lot of resilience and flexibility in my family, and that's going to be important for kids. So that's a soft skill that I think that we should not, you know, overlook. I do think also our understanding of technology and and students' capacity and educators' capacity to sort of quickly learn new technologies and use it, and the importance of remote access and internet accessibility. I think that's really been highlighted during the pandemic for schools, and I think we should learn from that and continue on that track, not relying on computers for education, but knowing that we might have to switch in and out of those in the future. And then I think the third thing we probably all learned is the importance of educators. So we haven't really talked about that today, but teachers and folks who are working in schools have been frontline workers through this whole time, and they have been working really hard to make sure our students are taken care of and are learning. And I think it's highlighted as a society how much we rely on our schools as a social safety net. So I'm very much hoping that we also attend to that with increases in budget for our schools that go along with how important of a role they do play for our society to function.
Great answer. Jeremy, your thoughts?
Well, one is, you know, of course, you know, the pandemic forced us to confront the realities of how outside of school inequalities are fundamental to everything that schools try and do, including improving and including boosting their students' outcomes. I hope that that's something we don't lose our attention on as we move into a different phase with the pandemic. A lot of our efforts in education policy and practice start from the assumption that schools need to compensate for those. I hope that we start to think about schools as just one in a larger tapestry of initiatives we have to improve students and families' circumstances. The other, I would say, I really appreciated so many examples of generosity and flexibility and support, whether it was from school and district administrators or even from our lawmakers at the state level and the national level. We gave families money, we gave them resources, we gave them relief in some instances, for example, suspending high stakes tests at certain points. We have to find a way to balance all of these priorities with that spirit of generosity and flexibility. I would love to see more of that. I know we're going to certainly continue to see it from our teachers and our school leaders, and I would love to see that same kind of spirit in our educational policymaking as we keep trying to deal with the ramifications from the pandemic.
Great answer. Tanya, what do you think?
Well, Katharine did steal one of my answers. Our teachers definitely highlighted how big of a role they play. Frontline workers. I mean, if your kids can't go to school, that impacts one of the parents or caregivers in the home immediately. So access to funding on a long-term scale so that we can keep classroom sizes low and more teachers in the buildings is going to be key. And then, you know, I look at some other great things that it brought about is, you know, the fact that we're on a Zoom today, and 3 years ago, we didn't know what Zoom was. It's connected families, it's connected parents to their school board meetings, to their PTA meetings, to other parent groups that allows them to collaborate and really talk through some of the things that they're going through. And our students as well. Our students have learned to communicate online better. I think they've looked at, things that work, and they've developed relationships that way, and then continued them once they've gotten back into the classroom.
Thank you so much. There's nothing I can add to that. You guys have been great. So thank you so much. I'm going to throw it over now because I think that the smarter questions are going to come from our readers. So I'm going to hand this over to Isabel Lohman.
Hey everyone, thank you for being here. I'm the new education reporter, so feel free to send any questions you have into the chat. We have a few questions from today, and then we also have questions from when you all registered. We have questions as well. So I saw that there was a link in there about the New York Times article where in New Mexico, there's the National Guard filling in for substitutes. One of the questions we got for the panelists was, can someone speak about the intersection of the teacher shortage, the significant reduction in people choosing to go into education, and pandemic recovery? Katharine, do you want to start?
Sure. That's a very critical and important question. So let me just start with a couple of things to say. One, there is a teacher shortage across Michigan in most districts and most kinds of districts and kinds of teachers. And so this is particularly the case, though, for certain kinds of districts and teachers like special education, STEM teachers in middle and high school, very, very rural and urban center districts. Think about the districts far up north. So we've seen the shortage. It's been growing over time. We have reductions in our folks entering teacher preparation programs. That's been a consistent trend. So the pandemic has accentuated it. What the pandemic did is it didn't cause this sort of great resignation that I think we've seen a lot of conversation around, although it may still. We do have survey evidence from across the state that shows teachers are very much considering leaving. But what it did do is it caused a certain subset of teachers to exit. And we do see increases in exits from the teacher workforce, especially from, no surprise, our very urban, lower income districts. They were much more likely to lose teachers during the pandemic than other districts were. You also talk to personnel folks, they'll say, we can't even get teachers. We're, everyone's poaching from each other. So it's causing a shuffle. We don't have it in the data yet, but we're going to look for it when we get those data in. So again, I think the main point is shortage is here. It was already here before, and the pandemic has exacerbated it. And I think the third thing I want to say on that, and then I'll turn it over to someone else, is someone asked about the frustration that people are feeling with schools. And I think that has, ramped up over the pandemic. And I think that we're seeing some blaming happening where there's kind of this us against them feeling between sometimes the communities and the teachers and the administrators. And that is making it much more unpleasant to work inside school buildings when you feel like you're being attacked for things that maybe aren't your fault or aren't something that you would even have chosen, but you have to for safety reasons or something else. And so I think kind of having some grace, as Jeremy said, and remembering that we're all people might actually help teachers to believe that they are feeling welcome in their school building. Tanya or Jeremy?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add for the Michigan context. I'll put in the chat for people who are interested 2 recent papers that are about, teacher burnout and teacher turnover. As Katharine said, we are seeing a lot of this negative sentiment from teachers. We're not necessarily seeing them leaving the profession at greater rates in the way that we might expect, but we need to keep an eye, of course, on teacher well-being because, I'm certainly concerned just reading about how teachers are describing their sense of self-efficacy, their levels of stress, and so on. And that's going to have consequences for sure. What those consequences are, though, like Katharine was saying, we need to keep studying to understand.
Great. And that actually sort of leads to another question that we got from a reader. We got a question about teacher mental health. So what are the things that we can do to sort of support teachers' mental health and sort of combat any sort of anti-teacher sentiment or climate that people are experiencing?
So I'll start this one off. So I think the first thing is our teachers don't create policy in our schools. They're just unfortunately there to enforce it. So parents having that understanding that although you might not agree with the policy, it's not the teacher that created that policy. It's the teacher's job to make sure that policy is upheld in their classroom. Looking at the mental health of our teachers, I mean, as far different as every student's example and life has been the last 2 years, our teachers have been going through the same things. Their home life and, possibly caring for parents or other family members, losing family members, all of that has impacted them as well. So as parents, when we say we want to give them that grace and give them that, it's not also then turning around and emailing and saying, well, where's all this extra information we need? Where's this? Like understanding that they're doing what they can in the classroom, and we should be there to support that and not pile on more work for them.
I'll add one more thing to that, because I think, I'm not sure, Jeremy, what papers you posted, but there was a new paper out recently that actually asked teachers, like, what would help you improve working conditions? And would it be compensation? Would it be, and compensation's always there. We definitely underpay our teachers across the country, but in Michigan in particular. But also they said more counselors in the schools, more special educators, more paraprofessionals, other adults who can take some of the work that teachers are doing right now to help support students and take that off their plate, so that teachers can focus on the education aspect and and they know their best is being taken care of. They actually said they would prefer that over increased compensation for themselves.
It's really insightful too, I think, for the broader conversation of education. Some people would say, I don't know if there's more money in the pot, but there's these other things that also contribute to what a teacher experiences on a day-to-day basis. Gotcha. Turning gears a little bit towards more of the student focus, another question that we got is, how do we keep students engaged during this time of burnout and uncertainty? And how has COVID-19 and COVID-19 policies affected, I think we talked about this a little bit, but we can highlight it again, affected high school graduates' enrollment in post-secondary programs? And I will share a link in the chat about high school graduates and whether they're going to college within 6 months.
So one little piece I can add is I know a lot of high school seniors and even juniors last year struggled with the pass-fail grades. So some school districts, knowing the challenges that remote learning was bringing, offered a pass-fail grade instead of the ability to possibly increase their GPA. So getting into college was definitely impacted by that for many of our students.
In terms of engagement, there is some research out there. There's not as much. I don't think it's harder to measure, especially because it's harder to get to students and get inside school buildings during a pandemic. But we hear a lot from teachers that they're worried about the engagement of their students, especially during the remote instruction piece of it. And I think we also know that just like us, kids like structure. They like to know what's coming the next day. And when we have a lot of this in and out of schools this year, where we've been having to close for a day here, a day there, a week here and a week there, that's very disruptive to students' mental health and sort of ability to focus on school and their level of engagement as a result.
Moving on to a specific subset of students, we had a few readers write in to us telling us to remind ourselves to talk about students with special education needs. We had someone say that online learning does not work for many students who have IEPs, which are those individualized education programs. And then they spoke about how special education students have felt like they've fallen out of sight and they're behind. Someone else has asked, what is the plan to provide compensatory services to special needs students for whom virtual learning during COVID-19 was both inadequate and inappropriate?
So it's bad that education keeps coming back to funding, and it does because there's so many things we can't do without it. So fully supporting federal programs like the IDEA is key when we talk about our special education students. The level of funding that is needed is so much greater at that level and has to be met. It takes a very special teacher to work with our special education students. It's a very hands-on, you have to have a lot of patience, and to support them, we need to have the right tools in place.
And for those who aren't familiar, IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It's a federal law, and there are guidelines in there for how school districts and schools need to provide services for students with disabilities and special education requirements. But I think that's an interesting point, and that's something that Bridge can definitely look more into. We have a few more questions. And again, if you all have other questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. This was a reader question. It says, in my district, it is evident that the pandemic is the straw that has broken everything. With teacher shortages, lack of transportation, increased incidents of student violence, to name a few, it seems that the job making up for learning loss falls to the bottom of priorities. How can parents and community members better support districts to alleviate any of these concerns?
Heard that several times, by the way, that, there are all these first order problems, like making sure that there aren't fights in the hallway and that kids are safe. And, also contact tracing, right? So this is fallen on teachers and administrators and other school personnel. All these things are taking away from what we were hoping this year would be, which was going to be a year to kind of bring kids back up to speed in terms of their educational outcomes. What can parents and families and communities do? Become a teacher, become a substitute. There are increasingly ways that the MDE has been trying to bring folks into the teaching profession. And I think that is, if you have free time, those are things that you could do to help alleviate your district's teacher shortage. And bring adults in the volunteer in the classroom when that becomes allowed again, right? We know we need small group instruction. And so if you have resources and time to be able to do that, once it's allowed again, I would really suggest that you do that. Even just things like Tanya was talking about, supporting our teachers just in the littlest ways, which means, maybe don't email them on a Sunday evening asking them all these things, give them the day off. These are small things that we may not think about, but they may help to make sure that the next teacher doesn't resign next year, doesn't switch to a different district. Also, at some point there may be a vote to increase, school funding in the state. And I would say this hopefully has taught us all how critically important it is to fully fund our schools in ways. We are, I want to say, in the low to middle range of school funding in the country. We have a ways to go. We are, $10,000 to $15,000 behind the highest performing states. There's a huge amount of evidence right now that shows that the more you spend on schools, the better students do on all sorts of short and long-term outcomes. It's not even a question any longer. And so as a society, we could start to value education in the way that we say we do.
Yeah, we're also getting some pretty specific funding questions, and I can try to find out some of these answers for folks and work on stories about these funding things. So we have just a few more minutes. Please throw in your questions, even if we don't get to your question at this moment. They are questions that we are going to consider when we are reporting and we're putting out stories. So we absolutely want to hear from all of you. So we've talked about, teacher burnout. We've talked about student mental health. We've talked about lost learning time and sort of what the test results are showing from that. In general, there's a question that says, to me, the pandemic offered an opportunity to rethink and reimagine what public education is, and highlighted some foundational problems with how we approach education, teaching, and learning. What are some of the possible changes that these panelists wish could have been explored or implemented? And where do we go from here?
I would have loved to see some really creative ways that we could have, impacted how we do education in this country. There's certainly some examples out there. There's a lot of examples around, letting kids play more and how much they learn in play. But looking at, this is a hard question. I mean, looking at what we can do, meeting kids where they're at, but also understanding, like Katharine mentioned, it's not going to be 1 year and we're back up to where we were. Letting our children know that it's okay where they're at now, and not giving into that pressure that they need to be better than what they can be at this moment.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I definitely think, there's a lot of different ways to answer this question. And I would definitely echo what Tanya has said in terms of the sort of spirit that might inform how we think about schools, that, that might represent a different way of looking at or approaching schools. Some people might answer this question, and we've seen this in other states. And even in Michigan, we had a bill introduced as well, related to restructuring things like school choice, or shifting the design of our school system. So, that's a conversation that we could have as well. I think the spirit of the question was more so in relation to, what are we actually doing in terms of like our instruction, our learning, and how kids are spending their time in schools. And in that vein, I definitely really support dedicating more time, just as we need to, and we need to find a way to support students instructionally, but we also need to find a way to make sure that students have the time they need for socio-emotional development. And we have to balance these things and take the long view on students' well-being and development. So I definitely think that, you know, a lot of what Tanya was speaking to, I would echo as well.
I'll just add in one more thing. This was a once in a lifetime opportunity in the sense that huge amounts of funding have been poured into our schools in the last couple of years. This is the time to buy the right curriculum, to think about how we can, you know, provide differentiated instruction to our students, to really upgrade our facilities. I mean, this is not the time to sort of do business as usual. We have a chance right now to think about how we can best use these resources to support our specific communities and the students within them. And I would just say it's not too late to do that. So I would encourage all the districts around the state to think seriously about how they're going to use those funds in the best ways to meet their students' needs.
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more question, but just to acknowledge some of the things that people are talking about in the chat, it seems like readers are interested in what funding looks like in the US compared to other countries, as well as both the state level, Michigan compared to other states. There's a question about the future of hybrid, if that's, you know, a sustainable model and something that there's a real supply and demand for. And then also some additional questions about special education students as well as IEPs. But I want to end on somewhat of a broad question. From your experience or research, what are your thoughts on what COVID has taught us about creating effective communication between schools, teachers, communities, and parents?
So now that parents are involved, I just encourage them to stay involved, to continue to attend board meetings of their Board of Education, continue to meet and talk with teachers during parent-teacher conferences to see how they can best support their student, and to work with the administration on policies they don't agree with. Walking away from this after we've now gotten so involved would be a big miss for families, I believe.
I'll focus my answer on, you know, communication strategies and technologies. I really liked you know, what my co-panelists brought up earlier about the role that these new technologies might play in changing the way we do education. And I think a lot of stuff was forced online or over the phone this year. Sometimes that was productive. I think sometimes families were more capable of joining, let's say, a parent-teacher conference when they were able to call at their convenience instead of having to go to the school themselves. In Detroit, there's a big effort to go to homes, to do home visits, especially when it comes to finding and students and understanding what their absence barriers are. But we heard from parents that they don't like those kinds of surprise home visits, that they would prefer to get a call or a text, you know, so go for it, please, you know, especially when home visits were suspended. That was a strategy that was used. You know, I'll stop there, but I think we have a lot to learn for sure about all the different avenues we have to communicate. I guess the other thing I would say is we have to make sure that with this increased technology and the ability to communicate so readily and frequently, we should be cautious not to overburden teachers, as Katharine was speaking to earlier.
Yes, and that I do think that, you know, personal experience as well as what I've been seeing in the data, parents are confused, you know, like we don't know what's happening day in, day out. We don't know if we should expect something to happen. So the more forecasting and sort of expectation setting that districts can do early and explaining transparently why they're making decisions would be very helpful. Not all parents can go to the board meetings on, you know, every other week that they're being hosted. And so I think it's important to say, look, here's how we're making a decision. Here's when the decision's going to be made. If you want to have some feedback, please, here's a survey that you can provide feedback if you want it. Those are all really important things that I think have happened more during the pandemic, and I'm hoping that they do continue.
Thank you all. I'm going to turn it back to Katharine Dugel real quick, and she'll close us out.
Thank you, Isabel. And thank you so much to Tanya, Jeremy, and Dr. Strunk for this really interesting conversation. I think I've learned a lot, and I hope that our readers will as well. I just want to remind everyone that we'll be posting the recording of this conversation in Bridge either later today or tomorrow. So feel free to share that with anyone who wasn't able to join us today. I also would like to remind everyone that we will be resuming our monthly lunch break series next month on March 30th. There will be an announcement coming soon. And I just wanted to remind everyone that if you would like to support these types of conversations and the great journalism that Isabel and Ron do, you can become a Bridge member at bridgemi.com. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon.